Three, two, one. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a returning guest who has just published a new book. The title of that book is Music is Power: Popular Songs, Social Justice, and the Will to Change. The author's name is Brad Schreiber. I interviewed him earlier this year, August 16th, 2019, about his excellent book that I highly recommend people read. The title of the book is Revolution's End: The Patty Hearst Kidnapping, Mind Control, and the Secret History of Donald DeFreeze and the SLA. And very important themes are contained within that book about social engineering, government infiltration, and really mind control. So I definitely recommend that book. Brad Schreiber's website, where you can see many of his other works, his other books as well, is www.brashcyber, BRASSY.com. His name is spelled Schreiber. It's Brad Schreiber. But again, the book is Music is Power. So, Brad, are you there?
Hey, it's great to be on with you again, William. Thank you very much, and I appreciate your good words about Revolution's End.
Awesome.
And, in some ways, just to touch on that briefly, the fake news, quote-unquote, of Donald Trump was, the sort of agitprop and the faux left of the SLA back in the days when Reagan was governor. So, they perfected their own version of fake news by creating a left-wing group that undercut the new left and their legitimate concerns.
Yeah,
fake news continues.
Yeah, so it's just another iteration of an ongoing cycle. But luckily, there is things to counter fake news, and that is really the power of music and the power of popular songs to affect beneficial change to society. And I love that aspect of the book where it felt also like a history book as well, of American history, where you detail these songs that we've all heard so many times on the radio, but it was great to read them in context of why they were written. But I think where a good start to go through is just start at the beginning of the book of some of the origination of what could be called protest songs, or these songs with a message. Could you talk a little bit? Talk a little bit about yourself, and then talk about how you got interested in the subject of this book, and then if you could start with that, that'd be great.
Yeah, and then we'll touch on the origins, which is union songs, worker songs,
Right.
which is Joe Hill, basically, and then on to Woody Guthrie.
Okay.
But, since we mentioned Revolution's End, William, this book, Music is Power, is sort of a combination of my interests of my last two books. So as you noted, Revolution's End was about the manipulation of Donald DeFreeze and the creation of the Symbionese Liberation Army, touches on the Black Panthers, the FBI, the CIA, drugs and mind control used on black prisoners. So that's a very intense story, very complex. But the book I did before that was a musical biography called Becoming Jimi Hendrix. It was written based on the research of a Hendrix historian I knew named Steve Roby. There had been other books about Jimi, certainly, but no book had concentrated on his origin story, his early life before he became a huge star. And it's a destitute and horrifying story. Poor, growing up in Seattle, no food, no electricity. His mother died early. He got arrested and forced to join the military. He got bounced out of the 101st Airborne. And then he found himself in Nashville. And there were really great players there. And he had to fight to get stage time. Inevitably, he came to New York. The black club owners did not accept him because they couldn't really comprehend what he was doing sonically. And then he was just discovered by chance, went to England, took over the entire rock world in 3 months. It was amazing. And then came back to Monterey. So that's the kind of passage that we have in Becoming Jimi Hendrix. So I put the two together, musical history and socio-political change. And that's why Music is Power came about.
Gotcha. And What were the intros like? You talked a little bit about the foundation. You said that some of these protest songs started as far back as the Civil War. Can you talk a little bit about those?
Oh yeah, well, certainly when Johnny Comes Marching Home and those sorts of songs were, patriotic, militaristic songs. They were certainly political because the war between the states, the Civil War, was obviously, a huge turning point in the history of our country here. But I started thinking, if I do a book about the most important and the most influential pop songs that were political, I can't just do rock. I can't just do the 60s. I want this book to cover every genre of music. So we start with the Union songs, and Joe Hill, the Union organizer who was unfairly blamed for a murder in Salt Lake City. And he was so noble, he realized the cards were stacked against him, that he came up with the famous phrase, "Don't mourn, unionize." And of course, the song Joe Hill is a great folk standard that many people did. I think most people would agree Joan Baez's version is definitive. So, Joe Hill, who was born in Sweden and came to America, became kind of a hero, even though there was an association with, other countries such as Russia. And there's always, this went through the McCarthy period, that kind of push and pull of workers have rights, but you can't be a socialist. You can't be sympathetic to communism because, of course, it's more totalitarian. I think, without going on too much longer, there's this fascination in my mind with America's inability to stand up for worker rights without blaming those people as being socialist or communist or totalitarian. And of course, the great irony, William, is here we have Trump, who probably has financial deals with Putin. There's no reason for him to, enrage half the country with his palling around with Putin unless there are financial deals, or they have what the Russians call kompromat, something compromising that Trump is afraid of. But in any event, I went from Hill off to Woody Guthrie, who, of course, is this incredible standard bearer of songs that were not only about workers' rights, but about the Depression, and the idea of immigration that the whole world is looking at. Because of war zones and totalitarian leaders, there's this mass immigration going on all over the world. And, of course, Trump's attitude about people coming to America as undocumented workers, we all know what his attitude is with the wall. Well, this whole thing is really echoed in a way with what was going on when Woody Guthrie wrote songs like Do Re Mi. If you ain't got the Do Re Mi, boys, if you ain't got the Do Re Mi, then you better go back to beautiful Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Georgia, Tennessee, because people were pouring into California. And I'm very sorry to say, here in Southern California, where I live, it's shameful the way this state handled the influx of people leaving the Dust Bowl.
Yeah.
Because they basically had no way to survive.
Right. I was surprised that they actually had military or police forces at the border turning people away back then. That was an interesting fact.
Oh, it was absolutely horrific. But, Woody, of course, had a great sense of humor, too. And everybody knows that Bob Dylan was hugely influenced by Woody's music. In fact, he went to see him in Long Island when Woody was dying. Such was the appeal of what he had stood for.
And he wouldn't he write on his guitar, this machine kills fascists? So he kind of saw that. But I actually, when I was reading your book, just to make a point, but I think it was timely too, because he talked about these Hoovervilles, and here in Southern California, I think we have the modern version of these Hoovervilles. I'm not sure if we have the modern version of the protest song that addressed this epidemic of homelessness, but Yeah,
Yeah, there's an idea for you songwriters out there. William just gave you a great lead.
Yeah.
You know, the Hoovervilles, relating to Herbert Hoover, the president and so forth, were huge encampments of homeless people. And a lot of this, of course, was brought on by not only the Depression, but the Dust Bowl, which made it even worse. And, Woody wrote a song about Hoovervilles, and it's just kind of heartbreaking, where he talked about the horrible quality of these people's lives, and that a young girl would be traded for sexual favors for a bowl of beans. I mean, literally, that's how desperate people were, and that lack of compassion for those people who are less fortunate than, say, the middle and upper classes. And you're right.
Those are still happening in these tent camps. My understanding is that there is a sex trade taking place that involves this type of stuff. Yeah, so people have told me about that. So
yeah, it's like history repeating itself all over.
Yes.
With what Woody used to write about, and Los Angeles has more homeless people than any other city in the United States. Partially because I assume there's more sunshiny weather, but there are sections now of many cities throughout Los Angeles County where there are encampments underneath overpasses, because that property isn't enforced by those cities, and it's just heartbreaking. And I think some of the great songs in history that are socio-political, William, whether it's about war or racism or whatever it's about, they're an appeal to the heart. They aren't just whining and vicious and yelling at and saying, you're a bunch of fascists. They're asking people to connect with their own hearts and say, this is the richest, most powerful country in the world. Why should this be? We need to change some things. So, Joe Hill and Guthrie, and then, of course, Pete Seeger, one of those great guys who spent his entire life trying to better the lives of people. Social justice was the way he lived. And I did an interview recently for Music is Power, William, and they wanted to talk about Seeger, and I said he was so committed to social justice that when he bought a house in Beacon, New York, which is a beautiful little town on the Hudson, upstate, he could have easily have retired and just done benefits every now and again. But no, what did he do? He got involved. He actually created an organization to clean the waters of the Hudson River, because to him that was an issue that affected people in the Hudson Valley. So
he was active,
but I'm bemoaning the fact that some people, like Bob Dylan, had their political period and then they moved on to other stuff. That's fine. But Pete Seeger and Joan Baez are two people who spent their entire careers, and Joan is still doing it.
Seeger's was a long arc, too, all the way back from the House Un-American Activities Committee all the way. I think he lived I don't know, is he passed away?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, but he was around for a long time.
But you're right. The gestation of his career was very early, and then the Weavers, his group, were ruined because of the Red Scare, McCarthyism, and he did not appear on television for a long, long time. I think it was something like 15 years around there. And who broke the blacklist against Pete Seeger? Well, this will blow people's minds. The Smothers Brothers, the folk duo that became a comedy group, and they were hired as a summer replacement show because they thought, okay, we'll have these guys sing folk songs and do comedy sketches. And CBS gave them carte blanche to do whatever they want because they figured they'd be gone in 3 months. Well, it became a hit. And the Smothers Brothers became more and more political. By the way, Steve Martin was one of the writers, and so was Rob Reiner on this show, the Smothers Brothers. And they brought on Pete Seeger, broke the blacklist, and he sang a song called Waist Deep in the Big Muddy. Now that song, and here's the thing, William, I'm old enough to remember as a little boy watching him sing it on the Smothers Brothers show.
Fascinating.
The song was ostensibly about a bunch of Army guys on maneuvers in Louisiana, and a new lieutenant takes over and says, we're going to march through here. And the soldiers go, no, you don't want to go into the big muddy. We'll drown. And, of course, the lieutenant insists, and inevitably by the end of the song, he is drowned. Some of the lyrics, and this shows you, how we've lost civility in speech, some of the lyrics of Waist Deep in the Big Muddy at the end are talking about that lieutenant who's leading his men. And they say, the big fool says to push on. And, of course, it was a reference veiled to LBJ in the Vietnam War. Well, they got 75,000 letters saying, how dare you put on Pete Seeger and criticize Lyndon Baines Johnson and what he's doing with the war in Vietnam. But it broke the blacklist, and it helped Pete Seeger continue to do his socio-political music. And the Smothers Brothers, did a couple of great years, but it's a whole side story in Music is Power I won't go into. They wound up suing CBS, and CBS countersued them. And it was all about the right of free speech. And today, you've got Trump saying the most loathsome things that if it were in the days of LBJ, people would want to remove him from office just for what he says, let alone what he does.
But Tom Smothers was pretty confrontational, cantankerous. Like, he really wanted his own autonomy. So it seems like he was constantly butting heads with the executives.
It's true. He actually loved going toe-to-toe with them. And the funny thing is the Smothers Brothers, when they were sort of breaking, they did a lot of work. They're from San Jose, so they did a lot of work at the Hungry Eye in San Francisco. And their original folk stuff was very silly and very goofy. And when they got the opportunity to do their show, Tommy Smothers loved butting heads with CBS. And, he brought in not only Pete Seeger, but he brought in a lot of wonderful artists. I know that George Harrison was on their show. And, of course, some people will remember that Tommy Smothers was there when John Lennon and Yoko Ono recorded Give Peace a Chance, in their hotel room with their bed in, right?
Yeah.
So Tommy Smothers not only went up against CBS, he kind of became a counterculture icon, which is so ironic.
Yes, I agree. Definitely agree. So, moving on from Pete Seeger was an interesting character, too, because he didn't quite come, my understanding is he didn't quite come from, he wasn't like Woody Guthrie, who really came from a hard Scrabble background. He was from somewhere in New England, right?
Yeah, he was. But he was a guy who could build a cabin and live in it. He was very hands-on. And again, Woody Guthrie's impact not only on Dylan but on Seeger, because Seeger was kind of the guy he handed off, what he was doing to. And Seeger, outside of the Weavers, was a fantastic voice and a great leader. And even though he got sidetracked by the blacklist, he was very inspirational to a lot of people. One of the more embarrassing things about Pete Seeger is, when he theoretically, people say that Pete Seeger, when Bob Dylan went electric at the Newport Folk Festival, that he tried to chop the wires to the sound booth. He didn't do that. He said, I'd like to chop the wires, because it was electrified, and nobody had performed that way at a folk festival before. The famous time that Bob Dylan, quote unquote, went electric. Of course, it's blown out of proportion. Some people in the audience really liked what Dylan was doing with Mike Bloomfield and the other members of his band, and some people couldn't hear it. And then some people in the audience were going, "Wait a minute, this is electrified music." We were listening to Joan Baez and other people singing folk music, with just their guitars, their acoustic guitars. So that's fascinating. Like I said, Pete Seeger was in it for life, and Dylan, of course, interestingly, after his motorcycle accident in New York, convalesced, and then he started writing more personal and more epic songs. And some of them are fantastic. I mean, I'd be sorry if he spent his whole career singing political songs and we never had, Tangled Up in Blue. But some people who were very much folky and very political were extremely disappointed in Bob.
He didn't seem to want to. Yeah, he didn't want to seem to wear that mantle of the politicized folk singer alone. He seemed to want to.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It was a huge responsibility, and I have some quotes in Music Is Power in the chapter with him and Joan, because of course they were romantically linked, and there was this love-hate kind of thing between the two of them, which is interesting to read about. But he did tell people are going to analyze my music forever, and they're going to ask, what does everything mean? And sometimes I don't even know what it means. Well, maybe he was fudging it, but certainly he had a right to grow and change, but he was worshipped, and he was one of those people who had as big an impact as his hero, Woody Guthrie, and yet he wasn't willing to write that kind of music for the rest of his career.
Interesting. And during that time, there were a couple other people. One who I didn't know about until I read your book. It was Phil Ochs, but also Joan Baez. So, can you talk a little bit about
Phil Ochs?
Phil
Ochs was OCH. Well, I was very fortunate because in the late '80s, William, I worked at KCRW, the NPR flagship station here in Santa Monica. In Southern California. And Michael Ochs, the brother of Phil, had his own show called the Michael Ochs Archives, and I got to know him. And so I got to interview him for Music Is Power.
Oh, great, yeah.
And he gave me some fantastic insight. I've used some of that interview in this chapter about Phil, who worshipped Dylan. And he and Dylan had, sort of a face-to-face confrontation. The short version is that Dylan had written, "Will you please crawl out my window?" Or can you please crawl out your window? And Ochs, who loved writing political songs, outside a small circle of friends being one of his big hits, Dylan asked him, "What do you think?" And he said, I like the other stuff better. and Dylan threw him out of his limousine in New York City. He said, "You're not a singer, you're a journalist." And poor Ochs, had mental problems, and he worshipped in Chile a political folk singer who was very powerful. He was considered a national hero, named Victor Jara, Jara. And sadly, when under Nixon, ITT helped organize a coup in Chile. ITT, I didn't even know this, William, until I researched Music Is Power. The reason ITT was involved in the coup that overthrew Salvador Allende is that ITT owned a lot of the telephone lines, the telephone transmission lines in the country of Chile. And it wasn't that Salvador Allende was a commie, it was that he was going to nationalize certain industries. And I know from all the guests you talk to that this is a recurring theme in American political history.
Yes.
The CIA and the United States get involved when their financial interests are threatened with a change of government, even if it's a duly elected government, which is what happened in Chile. So Allende was killed, Jara was murdered in the Santiago soccer stadium, and Ochs just fell apart because he worshipped the guy, and he also was mentally unstable. But he wrote so many magnificent songs about every possible subject. Some were like outside of a small circle of friends is kind of funny, and he uses ragtime piano. And other songs are just heartbreaking. He interestingly wrote a song called "The War Is Over," and of course, who's talking about Vietnam. And I don't know if we can ever prove this, William, but remember when John and Yoko took out all those billboards around the world and said, "The war is over if you want it"?
Yeah, it was in your book. Yes.
Beat them to the punch in 1975. You know, and he was just an incredibly gifted guy who was very sensitive. He became schizophrenic and inevitably took his own life. But in terms of variety of socio-political music, it's staggering what he left us with, the albums that he left us with.
And then Joan Baez too. So she was also in that kind of environment with Dylan. What was her contribution during that time?
Yeah, well, her contribution, as I say, even though she's 75 and supposedly has retired from touring, she's another one who spent her whole life. I mean, she was there with Mario Savio during the free speech movement at Berkeley, and a lot of very angry activist Berkeley students were annoyed with Joan Baez because she said, "You want to occupy this administration building, do it peacefully." Well, they didn't want to do it peacefully. They were angry at the administration of UC Berkeley and wanted to kick out windows and set things on fire. So her basic modus operandi has always been about protest, but peacefully. She knew Martin Luther King. She was there in the East Bay of, at the Alameda County Induction Center, trying to convince guys not to go to Vietnam, and she was spat upon. But what a remarkable life. She went to North Vietnam during one of the biggest bombing campaigns by the United States, and she talked with people. She saw the living conditions of people in North Vietnam, and it wasn't about, "I'm a communist." It was about siding with people who historically had seen nothing but warfare generation after generation. And her compassion is kind of remarkable. Obviously, I mentioned her relationship, her on and off relationship with Bob Dylan, which is interesting to read in and of itself in Music is Power. But even a couple of years ago, just to finish up with Joni, even a couple of years ago, William, she sang a really funny song that slammed Trump. So, she has never given up. She's been there during so many major socio-political events in our history. I don't know why somebody hasn't made a movie about her life, because it goes beyond belief how many times she was there in a major historic movement. It's just phenomenal.
And on the subject of Vietnam, talk a little bit about P.F. Sloan and his contribution and what happened to him. But he wrote one of the more important protest songs.
Well, yeah, and I think you told me that, and a lot of people don't know P.F. Sloan, and I'm really glad that I can make them aware of him. Phil Sloan was an incredibly gifted singer, songwriter, producer who wrote a song in '67 called "The Eve of Destruction," right? Barry McGuire was the one who sang it. It became a #1 hit in a very fractured United States of America, because also during that year, the #1 spot in the charts was taken up by Sergeant Barry Sadler, singing Ballad of the Green Berets, which was, of course, the complete opposite end. Right. Let's support what we're doing in Vietnam. And here, Phil Sloan wrote this song that he sang, but that Barry McGuire popularized. And so many people attacked him, including people in pop music. That was the worst of it. I think Sloan expected, people who supported the war in Vietnam to attack him, because basically U.S. sentiment about the war didn't really start changing until 68, and then finally Lyndon Johnson threw in the towel, as we all know. But Evil of Destruction had things like, you may go up for 4 days in space, but when you come down, it's the same old place. People were furious. How dare you suggest that we're wasting money at NASA going into outer space? It's a noble thing. He talked about, religious hypocrisy in that song that also at the time you could not touch in popular music. Hate your next door neighbor, but don't forget to say grace. Oh, man. I remember how people... And, of course, he was banned. He was banned on a lot of stations in the South, which is something, of course, that happened to the Beatles because of John Lennon's comment about, just jokingly saying, we're bigger than Jesus. And then there were, record burnings in the South after that. Well, again, the South in 67 rallied against Evil Destruction. But the worst part of it, William, was that people like Paul McCartney, I love the Beatles. The Beatles are my favorite group. But sadly, Paul McCartney, Paul Simon, I love Simon and Garfunkel's work, they came out in the press and they said, we don't like this song. It's too on the nose and it's too angry. Okay, well, in essence, that was a form of censorship. Creative artists going, we don't like the way you wrote your protest songs. We believe in our kind of protest song. And this means a lot to me, not only because I got to know Phil Sloan in the last 2 years of his life, but his autobiography is written by my friend Steve Feinberg here in Southern California.
And Sloan had a very colorful life. I mean, he wrote for and was associated with so many prominent acts as well. So, even though he wrote a protest song, he was involved in other things. It was interesting. You wrote an interesting thing about him writing Secret Agent Man and how that was used in that TV show. Oh, no, I can't remember. What's the name of it?
Yeah, exactly. Patrick McGowan,
yes.
Secret Agent. It was a British series that came over here. I think it inevitably led to what I consider one of the best series in the history of television, The Prisoner.
Prisoner, right.
Which was a wonderful allegorical kind of dystopian series with Patrick McGowan as a man living on an island with other people who are assigned numbers instead of names, and they're all former intelligence agents who have been basically kidnapped because they were fearful, the government was fearful they were going to leak information. How does that fit in with what's going on with Trump? But all that aside, to go back to, Phil Sloan, and the book that he wrote with Steve Feinberg, it's stunning to read that book because it talks about how he worked at Screen Gems, which was a music production company, and they refused to let him out of his contract. And they wanted to basically keep him as an indentured servant. And Dylan loved P.F. Sloan's work. He basically, you'll read about it in Music is Power, not to get into too much of it, but basically Dylan so loved Sloan's work, he said, you want to cover any of my songs, you got it. He wanted to record with him, and the company wouldn't let him out of his contract. In fact, threatened his life. And Phil had a mental breakdown. So the two Phils in Music is Power, Phil Sloan and Phil Ochs, basically were incredibly gifted guys who wrote socio-political music and kind of went crazy because of the way they were treated.
He ended up a long stint in, at Cedar Sinai, I think, down here in Los Angeles,
Yeah. And but even though I know in the last, say, 2 years of his life, he still had a wonderful sense of humor, and he looked at it with some perspective. And he joked about it. He said, I chose Cedar Sinai because they had the best deli food. But he was basically catatonic, William.
Wow.
And then he came out of it, and then he went to India. And, of course, his career was never quite the same. But there were some people who thought he bumped into Jimi Hendrix. And Hendrix said, this is hysterical. it's P.F. Sloan, who most people never heard of, and he's going to a concert, and Jimi Hendrix sees P.F. Sloan backstage. He goes, "Hey, you're P.F. Sloan. You wrote Evil Destruction. I recognize you." There were so many people who really appreciated that song, and that made it even more harrowing and awful that some of the glitterati and pop music turned on him.
There's a really good video of him singing the song online. I'll try to put the link to it in the show notes.
Oh.
But yeah, he talks a little bit about his background, but he sings the song, and it's very moving because the audience is filled with people of his same age group, all singing along or humming along to the song. They all know it.
It's a phenomenal story of what he could have done if, of course, if he'd been working in music now, it would be different because musical artists they're explosive. You know, they get on American Idol, and the next thing you know, they have a record deal, and nobody can hold them. Sadly, Phil Sloan, you know, basically was threatened to stay with the company, whereas he could have recorded with so many different people, done so many different projects. But still quite a character, and because I know him and Steve Feinberg, that part of Music is Power is very personal and very special for me.
Yeah, and you know, talking about Jimi Hendrix, he was he was kind of, I mean, you wrote of him as a post-racial superstar. He was one of the first kind of crossover types, you know, people that it seems like his music is so not, they wouldn't even call it, I don't know, Motown or whatever. It's just like, it seems like it's just American type music. What are your thoughts about his, and I was interesting fact in your book that Jimi Hendrix actually got arrested trying to get fed in whites only area, and that's kind of a piece of his history I've never heard talked about.
Yeah, we broke that, you know, in music. In Becoming Jimi Hendrix, we learned that Jimmy and his army mate Billy Cox, who played bass, you know, with him in Band of Gypsies, they were in Nashville, and you know, the first sit-ins, you know, civil rights sit-ins were probably Asheville, North Carolina, but right after them, you know, Nashville had lunch counter sit-ins because they were, you know, segregated. And, you know, Jimmy was in a house band in the Club Morocco in Nashville, and he and Billy would, like, take some sandwiches and go downtown and watch all the protests. And one day, Jimmy turned to Billy and said, "You know what? Today is the day, man. We're going to be part of this." And they went in, they sat down, you know, at the counter where the whites only were sitting, and they both got arrested. And the owner of the club bailed them out, but he made them pay for the bail. Jimmy was never a stridently political guy. In fact, you know, I do believe I kind of coined that idea of him being a post-racial superstar. You know, he had two white members, British white members of the Jimi Hendrix Experience, and he talked about spirituality, and he used wonderful imagery in his songs about liberation and greater consciousness, and that's where he came from, rather than talking about the Vietnam War. Now, I think that the reason he didn't talk about the Vietnam War is he felt sympathy for the guys who had been drafted. He himself was forced to join the military, or else he would have gone to jail because he was caught in a stolen car in Seattle for a second time. And back in the early 60s, they gave you a choice. They'd say, you want to do the jail time or do you want to join the military? So that's how that happened. The other thing I'll say, and I could obviously just talk the rest of the time about Jimmy because of that book, but one of the amazing songs that he has done that is socio-political has no words. And of course, it's the Star-Spangled Banner that he had been performing in clubs maybe 50 times before he did it at Woodstock. But of course, the whole country learned about it from Michael Wadley's film of Woodstock. And I've read many interviews. I've talked to many different people. I interviewed John McLaughlin, the great electric guitarist for this book, and he told me how choked up he was the first time he heard Jimmy's version of the Star Spangled Banner and the explosions and the sounds of gunfire coming out of that amazing controlled feedback. I've seen many music docs, William, where I remember Brian Eno talked about breaking down in tears the first time that he heard Jimmy's version of Star Spangled Banner. And it's fascinating because it's one of the few songs I can think of that is socio-political and has no lyrics.
And that's probably its power, is the fact that you know exactly what he's trying to impart, and the irony of this Star Spangled Banner and all the conflict and blood, sweat, tears.
It reaches you on a different level, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, a psychological level, rather than singing about being hit by shrapnel. You're hearing these screams and the zings. Interestingly enough, today I was listening to the jazz fusion group Weather Report, and maybe the only other song I can equate to Jimmy's Star Spangled Banner is a song called "The Unknown Soldier" by Weather Report, and in a section of it, it's free jazz where they're playing wildly, but they've got a saxophone that sounds like gunfire and the percussion, and then there's like screaming notes from Joe Zawinul's keyboard. And it's the only other song I can think of that depicts the horrors of war just with the music. So Jimmy really kind of always believed in spiritually reaching people. Remember, he said, not necessarily stoned, but beautiful. And are you experienced? So I ask you, what other musical artist during the psychedelic 60s had the balls to say, you don't have to take drugs in order to elevate your consciousness, but you need to elevate your consciousness if you want to improve the way the world is. And for that song alone, I just adore him.
Yeah, no, I mean, incredible music. I think amongst all artists, he's still considered to be the greatest rock guitarist in history, with a very peculiar arc of his life. You know more than I do. I haven't read your book on him, but he was like a background singer for some of these guys. There's actually videos him in a suit and tie playing pretty, laced up, accompaniment.
R&B.
Yeah.
He worked with, Curtis Knight and the Squires and, Little Richard. He was kind of the backup guitarist for Little Richard, and whenever he got, out of the spotlight and would take over, Little Richard would fine him. Or if he didn't wear the exact same outfit as the other guys, he would fine him. Yeah. So inevitably, of course, Jimmy was ready to basically be his own man. And
it was sad.
There's something transcendent. Transcendent is the word that I like to use with Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah, it's an incredible story. And the way you wrote about it, you were pretty conclusive that he was murdered by this guy, Mike Jeffrey. I had not come across that as, potently recorded as you did. I thought it was an accidental overdose. So
everybody did.
Okay.
So, you're not to be blamed. Almost everybody thought that he was part of the 27 Club with Jim Morrison and Janis Joplin, and he died at 27 of an overdose. Well, forensically, we can prove, not just, it's conspiracy theory or look at these odd threads. Literally, his lungs were filled with red wine, and he had 9 Vesparax tabs. Vesparax was a very strong German sedative on the market in 1970, and one of those would knock you out. Jimmy was not suicidal at all. Now, there are two, so you have the forensic stuff. The first surgeon who saw him in London said somebody shoved a bunch of wine and probably these pills down his throat, because very little of it got to his stomach, and his lungs are filled. He aspirated, right?
Right.
So here's the forensic stuff, and you say, well, why would Mike Jeffrey, his manager, want to kill him? And the answer is, Jimmy wanted his own recording studio. Electric Ladyland was the name of the album. Electric Lady Studios was the name of the recording studio that Mike Jeffrey had built for him in Manhattan. But Mike Jeffrey himself rubbed shoulders with the mob, which was very common in the late 60s and early 70s in the music scene, William. And he broke from the mob in order to build that studio. And he was paying them back. And Jimmy didn't like Mike Jeffrey for many reasons and was asking people, how do I get out of this contract? I need to find a good lawyer. And Mike Jeffrey was chasing all Europe. So clearly he caught up with him in London. And he himself was afraid that the mob was going to come after him because he hadn't paid them back fully for Electric Lady Studios. And in addition, there was even more motivation for Mike Jeffrey to kill Jimmy because he knew, hey, all those masters are going to go to me. I'm going to control his music after he's gone. Now, what kind of guy was Mike Jeffrey? The last part of this whole diatribe about Mike Jeffrey, he had been a member of British military intelligence.
Wow.
MI5. So I whenever people go, oh, it's too bad he overdosed, I go, he didn't overdose. He was taken out.
That's incredible. So then you have these two people, and it's unfortunately a very common story among artists is that they get in contracts they don't want to be in. So it's Hendrix and P.F. Sloan, both in the same boat. And Jimi Hendrix ends up dead. Sloan ends up going, cracking and ending up in a institution.
Yeah. But I will say, as much as I love Jimmy and I feel very close to him, that I kind of know something about him at his core, his fatal weakness, William, was he never looked at the contracts. He never bothered to see where, as long as Mike Jeffrey and Chaz Chandler were giving him money to buy cars and travel, he didn't take the responsibility to read the fine print. And,
it's not an uncommon story.
Yeah, it's not an uncommon story, and if you guys out there are in the music business or any other creative endeavor, you need to take the responsibility to learn a little bit about contract law. Trust me, it will serve you in the end.
Yes. Never sign a contract for over 1 or 2 years is my foundational position. Things change so fast. Never have a long-term contract. I mean, on many things. So.
Yeah, it's
somebody who did contracts
story,
for years,
obviously, with people going, I don't want to deal with all of that. Yeah. And the very last thing, by the way, about Jeffrey is there was a guy named James Tappy Wright who was he was a roadie, and he knew Mike Jeffrey. And Mike Jeffrey, on his deathbed, told James Wright, I had to. Here's the quote. I had to do it. Jimmy was worth more to me dead than alive. That son of a bitch was going to leave me. If I lost him, I'd lose everything. Of course, Mike Jeffrey didn't talk to Tappy Wright about his fear of the mob. But there you go. I mean, you've got forensic evidence, you've got quotations, you've got major motivations. Right. And thank God that Jimmy didn't notate music and would go into the studio and lay down track after track. Because that's how we got all of this music, despite only 3 studio albums.
Do you know what the value of his estate is year after year? Like some of these artists are still making money after they've passed away. Do you have any idea what the value of his estate was?
I don't know numerically how many millions of dollars, but ironically it was taken over by his stepsister because everybody else in his family wasn't in a position to manage it well. And one of the things, I'm realizing in talking to you about P.F. Sloan and Jimmy, one of the themes in this book is how these great artists who wrote socio-political music got caught up in the times and their own lives and careers were damaged. They didn't really do anything wrong. James Brown is in Music is Power. I don't think most people know that James Brown was the first person to lobby to make Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday a national holiday. Right. And he went to Richard Nixon. How crazy is this? He went to Richard Nixon and said, I want to meet you to talk about that. And Nixon used him. Nixon thought, if I can get the godfather of soul to be in a photo op with me, maybe I can get enough of the black vote to beat the Democrats for a long time. So he met with James Brown, said, I'll look into it, touted that he was friends with James Brown, and then, of course, did absolutely nothing about making Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday a national holiday. It was Stevie Wonder who then went on to organize that movement that finally resulted in that holiday.
Under Reagan, right?
But
Yeah.
James Brown, amazing performer, obviously, and his role in black politics in America when he, when he wrote "Say It Loud, I'm Black and Proud," all of a sudden, an entire race of people said, "This is the song. This is the song that says how angry we are, and we have a right to stand up." And being beaten and segregated in the civil rights era is over. From now on, we stand up. Of course, the Black Panthers development. So James Brown had this incredible power, and yet he associated with Richard Nixon. He talked about other people like Strom Thurmond, the ultra-conservative senator from South Carolina, being a pal of his. And what happened? His base, both black and white, deserted him. And it really crushed him personally, because he was about lifting yourself up by your bootstraps. And he thought, I'm going to befriend both Republicans and Democrats. And, of course, there was so much polarization in American society, William, that when he started being seen with Nixon and talking about Republicans, a lot of people said, you're betraying us. You're betraying our people.
Wow.
And it really hurt him personally, and it hurt his career. And that's the book as well.
That's unfortunate, yeah. But there's a lot more in this book. We're at 50 minutes, Brad. There's so many other bands, Peter, Paul, and Mary, Tom Lehrer, Pink Floyd. We've covered Hendrix.
We get into metal. We get into punk. I loved writing
Jello
about
Biafra.
the Sex Pistols.
Yes.
And the Dead Kennedys. That was really enjoyable. The Dixie Chicks and what happened with the invasion of Iraq. There's a lot of other stuff that people will find in the book.
Yeah, is there anything else that you'd like to add before we wrap it up?
Well, I always encourage my readers to, share stories with me. I sometimes find really interesting stuff that winds up in future journalism or books. So, BradSchreiber.com or BrashCyber.com both work. And I post a lot of the interviews, like this wonderful one with you, on a Facebook page, so you can revisit some of the interviews and other promotion that I'm doing.
And that's under Brad Schreiber, is that correct? On Facebook?
Yeah. You'll see me there. There are a couple of Brad Schreibers on Facebook, but you'll recognize mine. I have like a cartoon in the background. It's Liechtenstein with some girl talking to a guy named Brad. So you'll soon recognize when you go to the page, seeing all the links to my interviews and some of the cartoons, by the way, that I repost. I recaption cartoons and politically kind of put in new ideas. So that should be fun for some of your listeners to visit.
Cool. And again, it's the title of the book is Music is Power, Popular Songs, Social Justice, and the Will to Change by Brad Schreiber, just published this month, 2019. And there may be an audiobook in the future, so keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, Rutgers University Press, I'll say in closing, William, was a great publisher to work with. They put in 18 photos, 5 in full color, in the book at their expense, usually at the author's expense, and they've been terrific, and you'll enjoy it. I'm looking at a photo right now of James Brown in a huge crowd waving to people when he did a surprise visit to a high school in West Palm Beach, and it's just a wonderful. There's some very terrific photos in the book as well.
Yeah, it's a terrific read. I learned so much just reading this book, and it's remarkable for me to see how many of these protest songs, whether it's Marvin Gaye, John Lennon, are still being played on the radio, still in rotation.
Yeah, we need more musical artists out there to step up and fight the power. And you don't have to do it for your whole career, but one song can make a huge, huge difference.
There's a lot of material in the real world. Hoovervilles, sex trafficking, war.
I mean, I've learned some stuff from talking to you in this interview that I didn't realize about the homeless and sex trafficking. There's a lot of stuff to do, and you know, musicians have a very special power to communicate, William.
Yes.
It's not like lecturing people. It's not like listening to a political speech by a presidential candidate. People mouth the words of songs they fall in love with. So think about that as a vehicle to create social justice.
I think that I could argue and win an argument saying that songs are more powerful than speeches because people repeat the lyrics in their mind. They know the tune.
Yeah.
So very effective.
They
very
memorize
powerful.
it. They don't
Yes.
memorize. They don't memorize a stump speech by a candidate, but they can memorize lots of songs.
Absolutely. Look at some of these rap songs. Fight the Power. People know those lyrics backward and forward. They know everything. They know all the songs, whether it's from African artists or some of these other ones. They know them all. Everybody knows what's going on, you know. And they know the story.
Yeah. Gil Scott-Heron in that chapter, and you know, NWA and Grandmaster Flash. You know, they didn't do those latter two didn't do a lot of political songs, but when they did, man, they were amazing.
Very powerful.
You know, White Lines in the Message by Grandmaster Flash, some of the most powerful lyrics in the history of music, let alone hip hop.
Very true.
So anyway, it's always great to talk to you, William.
Likewise.
I really do appreciate the time.
Likewise. I appreciate you as well. I appreciate the books. Guys, go check out this book again. Music is Power, Popular Songs, Social Justice, and the Will to Change by Brad Schreiber. Thank you so much, Brad.
Thank you, William.
All right. Have a good night.